Hello. I want to speak a bit about today's big geopolitical news. Certainly one of the major news items anyway, which is President Obama's visit to Cuba under Raul Castro. Um, this is obviously a very historic occasion. It's the first time a sitting US president has visited the island nation in, I believe, 88 years. The last occasion was under President Calvin Coolidge in 1928. So we're talking about a truly historic day. I caught a little bit of the headlines earlier. I didn't see all the coverage, but I want to talk a bit about maybe some of the implications of this and some of my thoughts on whether or not this is the right approach as I see it. And this is obviously from someone who doesn't know all the details, but just a few thoughts really. Um, I think that détente with an authoritarian regime is always going to be a controversial issue. But looking at it from a basic perspective, it's hard not to have some admiration for President Obama's efforts, and let me explain what I mean by that. Um, when a leader of a democratic nation, albeit a very flawed democratic nation, but a nation that believes in freedom of expression, a nation that believes in personal liberty and other aspects that in democratic societies we hold very dear, makes a decision to actively improve relations with a system that is the exact opposite, that is ruled by a single party, that doesn't tolerate individual opinions, and basically has a very different set of values, then it is going to be controversial. And critics of President Obama will say he's being naive, he's being a pushover, and so on. So striking that balance is a real challenge. Here's the thing, there has to at some point be a situation where a responsible leader reaches out. It would be tempting to say that President Obama, or David Cameron for that matter, or Justin Trudeau, or any other leader of a democratic nation simply has this constant Cold War scenario with authoritarian regimes. I would make a slight comparison with this actually. That's when Xi Jinping visited the UK last year. There were a lot of questions about our relationships with China and whether or not David Cameron was basically sacrificing British values for the sake of the economy. In other words, we were going to stay quiet on human rights, China's very dubious record, in return for the Chinese investing in the UK. Now, there is some differences here insofar as President Obama has explicitly brought up human rights, whereas David Cameron and George Osborne specifically didn't. Um, some would say the situation is slightly different. China is certainly economically and militarily a more powerful country than the UK today, whereas the United States is absolutely far more powerful than Cuba. Cuba is a small country. Whereas in the case of the UK and China, it's a bit more balanced. So some would say that Obama has the upper cards anyway, simply because it's a case of David and Goliath. Um, One thing I would say is on the question of human rights, I did catch a bit of the speech. Raul Castro said this is an issue that should not be politicized. Well, to me, that is an excuse that every authoritarian regime uses. Human rights should not be politicized. The Chinese always come out with that sort of line. And basically, it's an excuse. It's a way to kind of sweep it under the carpet and say, we don't want to talk about that. We're going to continue doing what we're doing, and we don't want to talk about that. I've just been reading this article in the London Times, today's edition, see it there in the corner, and the White House has insisted that Obama is going to call the shots, that nothing is going to go ahead if he cannot meet with dissidents. And according to Ben Rhodes, Mr. Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, said the president would meet prominent dissidents. People have made enormous sacrifices for human rights. Josh Earnest, the president's spokesman, insisted that the list of people invited to meet with the president in Cuba is non negotiable. and Mr. Obama rather than the Cuban government would make the decisions. He added, I would not be surprised if there might be people on that list that the Cuban government would prefer we did not meet with. Um, I don't know about this. I've been following this story for a while now, not in depth, but I cannot help but feel that Havana is not necessarily playing their role entirely. I know there's been a few gestures. I think they've released a few dissidents, but they've made it quite clear that Cuba is going to continue as a single party system under the Castro brothers, and that an American concept of human rights are basically going to turn a blind eye to it. I think the Castro brothers have made that pretty clear. Now, what one aspect of all of this is, well, two aspects. Firstly, a lot of people say that they're concerned, both Cubans and non Cubans have said that they're concerned this will mean an end to Cuba's unique culture. Believe it or not, although I detest communism, I wouldn't want a situation where Cuba's culture is compromised. I mean, I don't want to see McDonald's opening up in Havana and that sort of charm that they certainly have, leaving aside the totalitarian factor. I wouldn't want to see that compromised. So the Obama administration is going to have to really convince the Cuban people and the Cuban government that's not their intention. I don't want to see an Americanization of Cuba in that sense. What I do want to see, as someone who passionately believes in democracy, I want to see a situation where people are not jailed for disagreeing with the government. And that's very, very important. Now, there is another side to this. Cuba could point out that the United States is not exactly a gleaming example of human rights, and there is a fair critique that America picks and chooses, and to be fair, so do other Western countries, when it comes to critique of human rights. So, in other words, Washington will criticize Cuba's record, but completely turn a blind eye to Saudi Arabia, and I guarantee you, the entire Republican field, certainly the front runners, are going to lecture Obama on this visit to Cuba, but they're not going to care about continued ties to Saudi Arabia. They'll continue to talk about the need for strong ties with our allies in the Middle East, by which they mean Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is one of the absolute worst countries in the world when it comes to human rights. I would say far worse than Cuba. And that's not to trivialize the situation in Cuba, but you don't get Cubans being flogged for blasphemy. Um, So certainly Washington picks and chooses who it criticizes when it comes to human rights. And the Cubans probably could turn around and say there's a hypocrisy in that sense. That doesn't mean I agree with their position, and it doesn't mean that I think that this situation is ideal. As both sides have acknowledged, this will take time. But in the end of the day, you have to weigh it up. If it's a case of continuing to simply have this embargo, continuing to simply have a constant Cold War scenario with Havana versus reaching out, trying to improve relations, détente, maybe the latter is preferable. I mean, Raul Castro's well into his 80s now, his brother's 89. They're not going to be around forever. At some point, I believe there will be a democratization process in Cuba. And I think that is more likely to be encouraged by détente than by Washington just always talking tough. I do believe it is essential that democratic governments speak up for human rights and say things that may be politically awkward. That is the job of a leader. It's a tough job, but it's what people expect President Obama to do. But I don't think this is a Chamberlain act. I think that Obama is taking a politically courageous decision insofar as no president has done this since Calvin Coolidge. I'm not sure what the background of Coolidge's visit was. Apparently, that was in a warship. But this is a historic day, and I don't think the reception so far seems to be very positive. So from what I can see online, most of the comments seem to be in favor of what President Obama is doing. Certainly for a lot of Cubans, I think it will be a good thing because it means they will then have more access to the outside world, insofar as Presumably, the visa situation will change. Presumably, there will be a gradual process for normalization of relations between the two countries. So, from that point of view, this is a good day for the world in that sense. Now, with Iran, because there's also detente going on with Iran at the moment, I think that's going to be more complex. Um, I believe it is a lot easier to negotiate with a communist government than it is with an Islamic theocracy. Um, and Iran recently tested missiles, so I really think Obama needs to tread very, very carefully with the regime in Iran. I do think Rouhani is more moderate than Ahmadinejad was, but that does not mean that he is a reformer in the sense that Democrats with a small d would want. Um, Iran still has a terrible human rights record, and I think Obama needs to be very careful. He has less than a year left in office, and I think he's clearly trying to make this a hallmark of his presidency. And in one sense, that is to be admired. Let's not forget Richard Nixon was widely praised for going to China. What happened? 7 years later, that visit was 1972. Actually, 6 years later, 1978, under Deng Xiaoping, China opened up. Now you could argue that was because Mao died, but it is what it is. Nixon visited China 6 years later. It opened up, which began a gradual, in my view, positive process for China being more open to the world. It's far from ideal, but it's certainly a hell of a lot better than it was under Chairman Mao. So maybe something similar will happen in Cuba. Maybe 10, 20 years from now. It'll be very interesting to see. I don't know enough about Cuban politics to evaluate what will happen after the Castro brothers pass away. Um, I don't think it will be a North Korea style dynasty. I don't think there's any other Castro. I don't know if Raul has sons or even daughters. I don't know much about that. I need to look more into it. But it will be interesting to see what happens after the Castro brothers. And balancing everything out, I would say today is more good than bad. However, the Obama administration needs to continue pushing Cuba and saying, we take human rights very seriously. And this can be reversed at any time if you basically let us down and turn back on your word. I mean, for Raul Castro today to say that the issue of human rights shouldn't be politicized, that is basically a way of saying we're not going to talk about it. So if I was President Obama, I would take that pretty seriously and say, look, we're going to talk about human rights if you want this to go ahead. It works both ways. If Cuba wants America to end the embargo, they have to play their role as well. And that goes beyond very small gestures. It goes to serious reforms. And for Washington's part, I would say a very diplomatic gesture by President Obama would be: we respect Cuban culture, we respect your unique culture, and we're not going to compromise that. And it comes down to complex and tough negotiations. But I hope that this is a step in the right direction. I guess history will tell. Let me know your thoughts.